Hey guys, I've just played a positional masterpiece. I know it's not humble to brag, but it's just facts. You should look at this game and I'm very impressed with myself. I'm usually self-deprecating with regards to my games and I consider myself not a too much talented player, but today something happened. At the end of this game, my opponent could not move any of his pieces. He was completely paralyzed. This was an example of complete positional domination. So it's round 5, the last round in the open mini tournament here in Almaty, Kazakhstan. I have 3 out of 4 points and I'm playing Arsen Yesentai, a talented junior from Kazakhstan, rated around 1800 at around 12 or 13 years old. And I'm playing with the white pieces. Let's dive into the game. So e4, e5. As you may remember, in the first round, I played f4, the king's gambit, and won a beautiful game. But I was sure that my opponent has prepared, and it's dangerous to play the king's gambit against a prepared opponent who is quite strong. So I decided to surprise my opponent, and I went for the 4 knights. And I used prep by Magnus Carlsen, none other than the GOAT in chess. Has played this move repeatedly, a3. This looks timid, but actually it is a dangerous variation. He has played this against Alireza Firouzja, and sometimes I choose this opening variation to surprise my opponents. So my opponent was prepared. He knew what to do here. He went for d5, top engine choice, bishop b5, and here there are various options. You can take on e4 with a knight, for example, or very logical and very possible, but d4 is another recommendation of the engine. I drop back here, black can take here, but then I'll take here, or first I'll kick back the knight, and then if here I take with check, and then I take on e5, and black is a little bit better, although it's closer to white is a little bit better, although it's closer to equality. So my opponent did not take this pawn, but rather decided to protect his pawn, which is top engine move. And I go d3, and around here is where my prep ended. I knew that this is a balanced position. I knew the plans that Stockfish recommends here. And from here on, I've played a game with 0 mistakes, 0 blunders, and I've played some positional chess that I'm really glad that I could make happen this time, because I'm not really a positional player. I usually, when I win in attacking style, sacrificing pieces, creating some chaos on the board, but this was not chaos, this was order on the board, so you will see what's happened. So bishop g4, I just go knight g3 to protect my knight with the queen, because otherwise he was threatening to spoil my pawn structure. So he goes h6, preventing my bishop from coming to g5, but I kick his bishop back and I castle here. And now the position is balanced. He castles as well, but here I think of a positional decision that I'm really proud of again. I exchange my bishop for his knight. Generally, bishops are better than knights in most positions, except for closed positions, except for some non-standard positions. Sometimes, for example, the queen and a knight are better than a queen and a bishop in most cases. But a rook and a bishop are better, for example, than a rook and a knight. And generally, a bishop is a long range piece. You should not trade it without any justification for it. Trade it for the knight. But here, the justification is that I create weaknesses for black. Now, black has 1, 2, 3 weaknesses over here. Those pawns are not too impressive and they cannot advance. Here, I've traded off my light square bishop, and the next thing I do is create a light squared blockade. I go b3 and a4. Look at this flying V, as they call it. So this bishop cannot do anything. It's not too menacing, and this pawn, yes, it can go to c5, but it cannot go to c4. I will just take it. So the pawns cannot advance. This pawn also cannot advance. So I've created this blockade, which will now enable me to advance to part 2 of my plan, which is knight d2, a backwards knight move. Not obvious, right? Many of you would ask, why did he do this? Why did he undevelop his knight from this active f3 square? Well, the idea is the following. In this position, I looked at my opponent's position, and I saw that f5, the f5 square, is a weakness. This is quite subtle, so pay attention if you want to improve your positional chess. The f5 square is a weak square. Why so? Because black cannot go g6 comfortably, because then this h6 pawn will get hanging, and even if black goes king h7, for example, protecting this h6 pawn, still g6 would be suicidal, because I will transfer my queen to h5, h4, for example. In some variations, I will attack the h6 pawn. It will be a devastating attack on the king. So black here cannot go g6. Therefore, the f5 square will always be up for grabs for my knight. But if I go knight f5 now, he'll just take, and the position will be equal, because this hole on f5 will be filled with my pawn, and he will blockade it with knight f6. It will not advance forward, and I will not be able to put any piece on f5, which is my intention. So if you see a hole, a weak square in opponent's position, you should try to occupy it with your pieces. But if there is a piece in opponent's camp that defends the square and disallows you from this occupation of this weak square, you should trade this piece. So the idea of knight d2 is to go to c4, let him trade, and then let's make some moves, nonsensical moves, for example. And if he takes, well, this is rook b8 is not nonsensical, but you get the idea. I take here, and now knight f5 will follow next. And my position is, of course, it's not winning. It's not a huge deal. It's a slight advantage, but slowly, this advantage may grow into something else. For example, if he just does nothing, stands here, I'll rotate my queen here, and already I have some dangerous attack, or maybe queen g4. Queen g4 gives white a huge advantage, actually. Already the computer says it's close to losing, because this is hanging, and this is hanging. Yeah, so very dangerous. So once I put my knight on f5, Garry Kasparov, world chess champion, famously said that a knight on f5 is worth more than a queen. Well, maybe not more, but it's worth something. So this is the plan that I wanted to implement. Knight d2, then knight c4. And if he doesn't take, for example, I go knight c4 and he doesn't take, because he doesn't want to allow me to go to f5, then this knight is on a great outpost here, because black has no b pawn, and black has no d pawn to attack my knight on c4. Well, black does have a d pawn, but it's gone too far. It cannot go backwards to attack my knight. So this is a great position for my knight, because it will be attacking this pawn, and then there may be more pieces added to the attack, and then there may be more pieces added to pressure this, and this will always be a weakness for black, and maybe black will lose this pawn. Actually, black will lose this pawn unless black trades here. And now again, I get this f5 square for my knight. And yes, the computer says it's equal, but it's much more pleasant to play with this with white. So this is why I did this strange maneuver with the knight. Now bear with me. What happens next? f5. My opponent also doesn't want to stand idly. He wants to implement his plans. And he sees that this f5 square could become weak. So he initiates a pawn break. Yes, he'll trade his bishop for my knight, but anyway, that's not a big deal. He wants to initiate counterplay, to go queen f6, rook f8, maybe give up this pawn but attack me on this flank. This is all logical, but he has created another weakness, another hole in the position, which I immediately take. Knight e4. A great post for this knight. Now there is no longer an f-pawn that could have kicked my knight. There's no longer a d-pawn that could have kicked my knight. The d-pawn has advanced too far. When you advance your pawns, you always create weaknesses in your camp. Sometimes it's good to advance your pawns. You control squares in the enemy's camp, but you also give up something. You give something, you receive something, but it's a trade-off. And here, black would dream of putting its pawn on d5 back, but it's not possible. Pawns don't go backwards, and this knight is great here. And the problem is that now I'm threatening some things, like for example, if black goes let's say, knight f6, I go knight g3. And this rook is trapped because the bishop controls g5 and the knight controls h5, and f4 is also controlled by the bishop. So the rook is trapped. He doesn't have the time to exchange his bishop. And once he goes queen f8, I go queen g4, and again, he doesn't have the time to exchange the knight because I'll take the rook. And also, I'm creating threats with all my moves. I'm now threatening to take this pawn because of this pin. So he has to drop back with his king. Already there is pressure, pressure, pressure. Bishop d2, I develop my piece. I eye this pawn. And the computer already gives some significant advantage to white. So it's not clear what black should do here. And once my opponent makes one small mistake, I wouldn't even call it a mistake. It's like an inaccuracy. Now there is no going back. What I calculated here was I think, 5-move sequence that leads to a winning endgame for me. So take a look. f4, a pawn break. Now, you know, a good rule of thumb is when you have made your opponent commit to weaknesses in his camp, you should trade down. You should trade pieces, go into an endgame and win it. Here, my opponent has multiple weaknesses. a5 is a very weak pawn. Once it falls, my a pawn will be unstoppable. c7, weak pawn. c6, weak pawn. No pawns can defend them. e5 also used to be a weak pawn, but I have to trade it to open up the position to go into an endgame. So once he takes, I cannot take because I have 3 attackers and he has 3 defenders. But I can take the bishop. That's what I calculated. He cannot take with the queen because the rook would be hanging. So he has to take with the pawn. And now I take with my rook. And he has to exchange because this rook cannot leave this file because otherwise the queen would hang. So this is all forced. And I take with the queen. This is all calculated by me. I spent some time, but it's not difficult to calculate this. This is all forced. If he retreats with his queen, if he declines the exchange, for example, queen d8, I will just take his pawn, then go bishop c3 and destroy him. So he has to take. I take. And this is the position that I saw. And I saw that this should be a winning endgame because his pawns are just horrible and he doesn't have any time to protect all his weaknesses in his camp. So he went rook d8, protecting this pawn. But then I just went back, bishop b2, bishop d2, attacking this pawn. And if he just stands passively like rook a8, I would go rook e1, infiltrate, take all his pawns, and this is over. Or maybe infiltrate to the 7th rank also, okay. So he decided to go for active counterplay after bishop d2. He's a strong player, so he doesn't just give up. He goes rook e8. It's a great resource. You should not just stand idly and suffer and suffocate in such endgames. You should initiate counterplay. So obviously it's losing here if I take the pawn, but he has some counterplay. He goes knight d5, and then he goes knight e3 or rook e2, and then knight e3, pressuring the g2 pawn, the c2 pawn. He tries to get some counterplay. Probably this is winning. The computer says, yeah, it's much better for white after rook e1. But at least he gets this move, for example. And yes, it's winning, but not obvious. What I want to do is not give him any chance at all. That's what my coach, Grandmaster Farukh Amanatov, told me. You should not give your opponent any hope, any chance. You know what I heard? I think Garry Kasparov said it. Good chess players are those who do not allow their opponents to show their potential. So you should disallow your opponent from playing the game that they would wanna play. You should disallow them from any creative tactics or like counterplay when they're worse. You shouldn't just allow this nonsense to happen on the board. Rook e1. I'm not taking this pawn. I don't need to take this pawn. I'm fine with exchanging the rooks because the bishop endgame, bishop against knight, is winning again because of this weakness. He cannot protect this pawn. So he has to go back to defend his pawn. But now I infiltrate rook e6 and some pawns will have to fall. He tries to defend knight c8. And here I check him. And here I could win a pawn again. Bishop takes a5, rook takes, rook takes c8. But again, this gives him some counterplay. He can go rook c5, maybe take this pawn. Yes, this is again winning, but why allow counterplay? Why calculate those variations? I have achieved a dream position. His pieces are paralyzed. His pieces are stuck. His knight cannot go out. So I just do what I really wanted to do in this position. All my pieces are on their dream squares. This rook is very active, disallowing anything from happening here. So the only pieces that has not been activated yet is my king. So I just walk my king, king f2. And the position is hopeless. The computer gives +2.5 to white, overwhelming advantage. The problem for black is that they cannot move the knight because it's pinned. Yes, they can go knight b6, but I just take here and I take on a5. And you probably know this. If you don't, you should know this. When the bishop and the knight are separated by just 2 squares, this is ideal for the side with the bishop because the bishop controls all knight's movements. So this knight is trapped. It's not participating in the game. And I can just win the game because I'm practically up a piece in this position. I can just march my pawns, for example, and queen them, or walk my king. Anything wins here. So he cannot get rid of this pin. He cannot go knight b6. His rook cannot leave the defense of the knight. So he is absolutely paralyzed. He tries to walk his king to say maybe to help, maybe to get here. That would be a dream for him. But again, I disallow any sort of counterplay. Rook f8. Now his king is cut off as well, and he cannot get to this side of the board. Even if he could, it would be losing for black. But I don't want to calculate anything. I don't want to allow any complications. I want to win a clean game and not give my opponent any chance. He goes king h5. I go king f3, continuing my plan of activating my king. He goes g5, trying to initiate some counterplay. I go rook g8. And now I've cut him off again. He cannot go to g6 with his king. He is close to being mated already. Because my plan here is, if he does nothing, is to go bishop e1. And whatever he does next doesn't matter. g4 is checkmate. Because the king doesn't have any squares. It is trapped. So here, he could have resigned, but he went for knight b6. And again, actually here, I could have sacrificed the rook and gone for g4 check, king h4, and king g2. And if he takes the rook, he's checkmated with bishop to e1. I could have calculated this variation, and that would be winning. But I didn't want to calculate anything here. Again, I wanted to exert positional domination in this position. So I took his rook and I took his pawn. And here, my bishop is restricting his knight completely. His king is stuck here, not in time to join the action here. So once he goes d5, I go b4. And my next moves will be b5, b6, b7, b8 queen. So my opponent resigns in this position. I get 4 out of 5 points in this tournament. It was a mini tournament, just 5 rounds within 3 days. I like this format, actually. I didn't have to go to a different city, a different country, as I sometimes do for tournaments. So I just played within 3 days 5 classical chess games. I'm quite satisfied with the result. My rating has not risen a lot. Unfortunately, I did not convert a winning advantage against an international master. Check out that game. I could have won easily in one move, but something happened to me in time trouble. Although the game itself was nice. Check it out if you missed it. So I've added some rating points, but not a huge amount. I'm now approximately 1900 rated, and I'm looking forward to upcoming tournaments where I'll be able to prove that I'm a good player and that I'm developing, and to continue my journey to the FIDE Master title. Thank you for watching those videos. If you liked this series of recaps, drop a comment. So I forgot to say, with 4 points out of 5, I'm in shared second place. 4 people actually share this second place. The first place is the International Master that I've played yesterday in a tragic, losing in a tragic way. So he is on 5 out of 5, and 4 people are on 4 out of 5, among them yours truly. I think due to Buchholz, which is a system used to determine who has the better stats, I'm the 4th place, so I get some small money in this tournament. I enter the prizes, which is fine, and that's it. See you in the next one. Bye bye.